The warning sticker was flaming orange, slapped across the windshield of my boat trailer like a badge of shame. In giant block letters it screamed, "Unauthorized vehicle, subject to immediate tow by HOA order." I stood there in my driveway, coffee mug in hand, blinking at it like I was in some kind of prank show. Except this was real. And the HOA wasn't kidding. I live in a coastal neighborhood on the edge of town where boats in driveways are as common as mailboxes. Been here for over a decade. My name's Jonah Fielding. I'm 52, widower, run the only functioning marina in town, Fielding Harbor Dock and Lift. I've got contracts with half the fishing fleet and every sailing snob for 20 miles. But none of that mattered to Elaine Jacobs. Elaine is the HOA president. Think bleached blonde bob, wraparound sunglasses, and the personality of a malfunctioning blender. She'd been gunning for me ever since I refused to trim my hedges into those weird spirals like hers. I was still reading the sticker when she marched up my driveway like she owned it. "Jonah," she barked, clipboard in hand. "That boat violates Section 12, subsection B of the HOA guidelines. No recreational vehicles in driveways longer than 72 hours. I stared at her. "Elaine, I just brought it home yesterday. I had to replace a fuel line before taking it back to the marina." She didn't blink. "Doesn't matter. You've already received your final warning. We've scheduled a tow for tomorrow morning." I actually laughed. "You're kidding." "You're towing my boat from my own driveway." "It's not your driveway," she snapped. "It's community property under HOA jurisdiction. Read your covenant." I shook my head. "That's not how property law works, but okay." She scribbled something on her clipboard like she was issuing divine judgment. "You'll be fined $200 per day until the violation is resolved. I suggest you move it or it'll be moved for you." Then she turned and stomped off, heels clacking like a metronome of madness. Now, I could have just moved the boat back to the marina. But something about the smug way she said it rubbed me raw. Elaine had been pushing people around for years, fining folks for leaving garbage cans out an hour too long, threatening retirees for planting the wrong kind of tulips. Enough was enough. She had no idea who she was messing with. That evening, I made 3 phone calls, one to my lawyer, one to the tow company she listed on the sticker, and one to my dock manager asking him to prep a little surprise. By morning, this wasn't going to be just about a boat. It was going to be about who really ran this town. By dawn, the dew hadn't even dried on Elaine's ridiculous tow order before I was already 2 steps ahead. The first call I'd made the night before my lawyer, Lee Dunbar, was already paying off. She'd gone through our HOA's governing documents line by line and unearthed something beautiful. Turns out, the HOA had amended several enforcement procedures without a proper vote. Bylaw changes require a 2/3 majority of homeowners, and Elaine had simply waved them through during an executive session that wasn't even open to the community. Illegal as a $3 bill. But that wasn't even the best piece. The company Elaine hired to tow my boat, Dunham Recovery. I'd spoken to the owner, a guy named Curtis, who'd been contracted out by the HOA for 2 years. What he told me was gold. "She's been pushing us to tow vehicles off private property without court orders." I told her that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. She said she'd indemnify us through HOA funds. "That legal?" I didn't answer. I just told him to hold off on coming to my house. He was more than happy to delay. By 7:30 that morning, I was out front in my work boots, leaning against my mailbox, watching a few early risers walk their dogs. My boat trailer sat parked exactly where I'd left it, but now it had something new. A laminated sign attached to the hitch with one clear sentence. "Private property surveillance in place, unauthorized towing subject to civil action." Elaine showed up 10 minutes later, wearing a crimson windbreaker and dragging that clipboard like it was her badge and shield. But she wasn't alone this time. 2 other board members trailed behind her. Jim, an accountant who rarely spoke up, and Sandra, who ran the neighborhood newsletter and had a voice like a violin string under tension. Both looked uneasy. Elaine pointed at the trailer like she was conducting an orchestra. "You're obstructing community traffic flow," she declared. "The tow company will be here any minute." "Not anymore," I said, sipping from a thermos. "They canceled." Her face twitched. "I didn't authorize a cancellation." "You don't need to," I said. "They did it on their own, something about not wanting to be named in a lawsuit." Sandra glanced at Jim. He looked down at his shoes. Elaine took a step forward. "You're not above the rules, Jonah. Just because you work on boats doesn't mean you can park one wherever you like." I didn't move. "This driveway's on my deed. It's not community property, and your revised enforcement guidelines." "Illegally passed. My lawyers got the files if you'd like to see them." Jim cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Wait, they weren't voted on." Elaine didn't turn toward him. "That's not relevant. The board has executive discretion." "No, it doesn't," I cut in. "Not for amending bylaws." "You need a vote. You didn't get one." Sandra looked visibly shaken. "Elaine, is that true?" Elaine's jaw set like concrete. "We'll revisit the matter at the next board meeting. In the meantime, the violation stands and fines will be issued daily." I nodded slowly. "Then I guess I'll have to challenge those fines. Publicly. You know, maybe even bring it up with the city's zoning board. See, I had lunch with Councilman Ray's last week. He's been curious about how HOAs overstep their bounds. Loves a good case study." Elaine turned and stormed off without another word. Jim and Sandra lingered for a second, then followed, but I wasn't done yet. That afternoon, I pulled a few strings down at City Hall. Not only was I the Marina's owner, but I also sat on the advisory board for shoreline development. It wasn't a flashy position, but it gave me access to zoning records, land use permits, and most importantly, community easement maps. I dug into the original plat for our neighborhood. And there it was, a note buried in the 1993 records. Driveway parcels to be retained as private property under individual lot ownership, not HOA-managed common areas. Elaine had been bluffing her authority for years, so I printed it, blew it up to poster board size, and brought it to the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Word had spread fast after the morning's showdown. I spotted neighbors I hadn't seen in years, people who'd quietly endured fines for mailbox colors, hedge heights, and unsanctioned porch furniture. They were done staying quiet. Elaine sat at the head of the table, flanked by the rest of the board. Her mouth was tight, her hands clasped like she was bracing for a storm. I didn't wait for the open forum. I raised the plat map high and walked right to the front. "This," I said, tapping the board, "is the original zoning document for our subdivision. It proves every driveway is individually owned, not common property, not HOA jurisdiction, which means every fine you've issued based on that claim, unenforceable. Possibly even fraudulent." A murmur swept through the room. Elaine opened her mouth, but I kept going. "Furthermore, the enforcement amendments pushed through last year, never voted on. That's a violation of the bylaws and state HOA code. I've already submitted a formal complaint to the Department of Consumer Affairs and provided them with copies of all related documents." The room was dead silent. One of the neighbors, Mr. Geller, former Army colonel, tough as railroad spikes, stood up. "You telling me the fines I paid for parking my RV in my own driveway were bogus?" I nodded once. He looked at Elaine. "I want my money back." Another voice piped up, then another. Elaine stood. "Everyone, please, this meeting is still under order. We'll handle this through proper channels." "No," I said, locking eyes with her. "You'll answer to the community, tonight," and then I dropped the final card. "I've also filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office. Because if HOA funds were used to indemnify a private tow company for illegal seizures from private property, that's not just a civil issue. That's criminal misuse of community funds." Elaine went pale. The board called an emergency recess. By the time they returned, it was without Elaine. She'd quietly left through the side door, never to return as president. Sandra took the mic, voice shaking, and announced that the board would be holding a special election within 30 days. All enforcement actions would be suspended pending legal review. Refunds would be issued where appropriate. And most importantly, a third-party audit of the HOA's finances was being commissioned. I didn't say anything else. I just rolled up my plat map and walked out of the clubhouse to a round of applause that followed me to the parking lot, but I wasn't looking for praise. I was already thinking about the next steps because dismantling Elaine's grip was only the beginning. The whole system needed cleaning, and I had just the team in mind to do it. 3 days after the meeting, a plain white envelope showed up in my mailbox, no return address, no logo, just my name typed clean across the front. I opened it at the kitchen table while my coffee cooled beside the morning paper. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature. Just a line printed in bold black ink, "Drop the complaints or the Marina gets a surprise inspection." I sat back in my chair staring at it. Threats weren't new to me. I'd dealt with drunk fishermen, bankrupt yacht owners, and one guy who tried to bribe me with a Rolex to skip a 5-year maintenance inspection. But this wasn't some desperate contractor or angry customer. This was deliberate, tied directly to the mess with the HOA. I folded the note and placed it in a sandwich bag, careful not to smudge anything. Then I called Lee. She picked up on the second ring. "You got mail," anonymous threat, I said, "promising a surprise inspection at the Marina if I don't back off." She didn't ask questions. "Bring it in." I'll loop in a contact at the district attorney's office. By the time I reached her office, she had already set up a meeting with a detective from the county's economic crimes unit. As it turned out, the district attorney had received several complaints from other neighborhoods involving suspicious HOA conduct, mostly financial irregularities, but with nothing solid to act on until now. The note elevated everything. It proved someone was trying to suppress legal action through coercion. That pushed us from civil territory into criminal. Detective Morneau came in wearing a windbreaker with his badge clipped to his belt, eyes sharp and quiet. He took the letter, bag and all, and asked only one question. Who on the HOA would have access to the kind of leverage needed to trigger an inspection? I didn't even hesitate. Elaine Jacobs. He nodded once. "We'll run a trace on the printer and check postal drop points. Don't tell anyone about this outside your attorney." I left Lee's office with a strange feeling in my gut, not quite fear, not quite adrenaline. It was the sense that something bigger was unraveling just beneath the surface. Back at the Marina, I found my dock manager, Reese, standing near the boat lift with a clipboard. He was mid-40s, ex-Coast Guard, and had a sixth sense for trouble. "You look like someone just ran over your dog," he said. Threats came in, not from a customer. He didn't ask. He just handed me the clipboard. "We've got something else you'll want to see. One of the guys found this on the service dock this morning." Stuck to the underside of the fueling station was a GPS tracker, not marine grade, not commercial. Just a cheap magnetic unit, the kind you buy online for fleet surveillance. It wasn't transmitting anymore, but the implication was clear. Someone had been tracking boat activity. We turned the device over to Morneau that afternoon. That evening, a new face showed up at the Marina. Tall guy in a city vehicle, wearing a clipboard like a shield. He introduced himself as a zoning compliance officer and claimed he was there to perform a routine check on shoreline modifications. I asked to see the order. He hesitated, then handed over a copy of a permit request filed under the name East Shore Neighborhood Council. "Never heard of them," I said. "They're listed as a community advisory group." "They don't exist, not officially," he frowned. "Then someone used a fake entity to file this," I nodded. "And if you dig, I'm guessing the contact email traces back to someone on my HOA." He didn't argue. Instead, he packed up his clipboard and said he'd be following up with the city attorney. By the next morning, things escalated again. The Marina's main server used for scheduling, invoicing, and dock assignments was hit with a ransomware attack. Our backup systems held, but the message left behind was unmistakable: "Stay in your lane." Lee contacted the district attorney's office again. Morneau called me within the hour. "They're panicking," he said. "This level of activity means they know you're close to something they don't want uncovered." "Then we're doing something right," I said. He agreed. That afternoon, Morneau's team served a search warrant on the HOA office. It wasn't much a shared space in a converted duplex on the edge of the neighborhood, but it yielded more than expected. Inside, they found a locked filing cabinet containing purchase orders for surveillance equipment, including the exact GPS model found at my docks. There were also unfiled reimbursement forms for legal consults, paid with HOA funds, but directed toward private attorneys not listed on any contracts. Even worse, a payment trail led to a local zoning clerk, someone who'd been quietly approving shady requests for property inspections without verification. Elaine had been greasing palms. The paper trail was enough to freeze the HOA's accounts pending investigation. The board, now operating without her, issued an emergency statement suspending all enforcement actions and called for an external audit firm to review the past 5 years of operations. I didn't attend the next board gathering. It was held in a borrowed church basement and moderated by an attorney from the state's homeowners' council. But I heard from neighbors who did. Elaine's name came up more than 20 times in connection with financial misconduct, unauthorized surveillance, and misuse of community funds. She didn't show up. 2 days later, she was arrested in her driveway. Morneau told me she'd been charged with wire fraud, coercion, criminal misappropriation of funds, and obstruction. The zoning clerk who'd approved the fake inspections, also in custody. Turns out he'd been taking under-the-table payments to flag certain properties for made-up violations. The community's mood shifted overnight. Neighbors who'd lived in quiet fear of fines and warnings began talking to each other again. People who'd never spoken beyond a nod at the mailbox started swapping contact info, forming a coalition to draft a new charter for the HOA, one built on transparency, accountability, and community involvement. I stayed mostly hands-off for that part. My role had been to light the fuse. The rest was theirs to carry forward. Still, I did one last thing before stepping back. I hosted a block-wide Marina tour for the entire neighborhood. Free rides, seafood, live music on the docks. Just a way to reconnect people to each other, and to remind them that no one person gets to rule over a neighborhood with fear. As the sun dipped behind the harbor, I stood on the upper deck of the tour boat and watched kids run barefoot across the planks, couples sipping cold drinks, dogs napping in the shade. Reese came up beside me. "Feels different now." "Yeah," I said. "Feels like we took something back." He looked out at the crowd. "What happens if someone tries this again?" I thought about it for a second. "Then we do it again, only faster." He grinned and walked back down to the lower deck to help with cleanup. I stayed there a while longer, watching the tide roll in, the sky turning soft with orange and lavender. My boat still sat in my driveway, untouched since the day Elaine tried to make an example out of me. Turned out she was the example. And the whole neighborhood learned what happens when power is used to punish instead of protect. And next time someone thinks about stepping out of line, they'll remember the guy who ran the only marina in town and wasn't afraid to fight like hell to keep it honest. The marina fundraiser had barely wrapped before the subpoenas started landing like bricks. 3 board members received them: Sandra, Jim, and a newer guy named Tyler who'd only joined a few months prior. They weren't leads on the investigation, but the district attorney's office wanted testimony from anyone who'd handled HOA finances, received internal emails, or attended closed-door enforcement meetings. I didn't hear much from Sandra at first. She ducked most of the public chatter after Elaine's arrest, which made sense. The community was still figuring out where everyone stood. But when she called me late one evening and asked to meet at the old bait shack behind the docks, I knew she had something she couldn't risk saying over the phone. "I won't stay long," she said, stepping inside, arms crossed tightly over a navy cardigan. I need to clear something up. I motioned to the bench by the wall, the place where my father used to sharpen hooks when I was a kid. Go ahead. She sat but never quite relaxed. Elaine kept a second laptop, not the one from the HOA office. This one she never brought to meetings. I only saw it once, but I remember the model. Silver Dell, fingerprint scanner, weird sticker on the lid like a koi fish. I leaned forward. Where? Her house, in the upstairs study. She used to say it was her personal notes, but I saw her reviewing surveillance logs on it once. It wasn't just footage from motion sensors. She had timestamps, entries, names, notes about residents. She was tracking people, Jonah. I didn't ask why she hadn't come forward sooner. The look on her face said enough. Fear makes people quiet. But now that Elaine was in custody, the dam was breaking. Is it still there? I don't know. But if it is, it's probably behind the bookshelf. There was a false panel. I didn't waste time. I passed the tip to Morneau, who obtained a secondary warrant for Elaine's residence. 1 week later, the laptop surfaced, encrypted but not enough to keep the state forensics team out. What they found inside blew the case wide open. Elaine hadn't just been tracking boats or writing down plate numbers. She had built a full-on resident dossier system, logs of when people left for work, who got deliveries during the day, patterns of when trash bins were brought in. She even had a digital folder titled Compliance Leverage, filled with photos, emails, and in at least one case, hacked screenshots from a resident's home security system. That last one escalated things immediately. The state cybercrimes division took over that angle of the case. Unauthorized network access. Illegal data harvesting. When the techs traced the spoofed IP to a signal bouncing off a booster antenna mounted on HOA property, it was all but confirmed. Elaine had been using community-funded infrastructure to conduct illegal surveillance. The kicker. Several of the files were marked with future HOA enforcement dates, and draft violation notices, ones that hadn't even been issued yet. Someone else had seen those logs. Someone on the board. The district attorney's office began issuing new subpoenas, not just for testimony this time. For potential accessory charges. That's when Jim finally spoke up. He asked to meet in person, but not at the Marina. Instead, we sat in the back of a shuttered diner 2 blocks from the neighborhood. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I didn't know how bad it was, he said, eyes locked on the coffee in front of him. At first, it was just emails. She'd send me drafts of warnings, ask for input on fine amounts. I figured it was procedural. But after I raised questions about the enforcement revisions, she stopped copying me on anything. You're telling me you had no idea she was running digital surveillance? I suspected something, but I didn't see the full picture until Morneau showed me the logs. That's when I realized she had been using board signatures on approvals we never saw. I believed him. Jim never had the stomach for confrontation. He was the kind of guy who paid HOA dues a month early just to avoid the follow-up letters. She forged your names? Not exactly. She used generic board approval forms, but the signatures were scanned in. From old documents. Mine, Sandra's, even the guy before Tyler. We never signed off on the surveillance budget increases. That sealed it. Elaine hadn't just manipulated the system, she had manufactured consent. With that information, the DA's office filed additional charges: criminal forgery, unlawful use of signatures, and misappropriation of surveillance funds. But the real bombshell came from the financial audit. The third-party firm found that over $40,000 in landscaping fees billed under common property enhancement had been funneled into a shell company registered under Elaine's cousin's name. The company didn't exist beyond a P.O. box and a bank account. And the money? Spent on personal travel, cosmetic surgery, and a down payment on a condo 2 counties over. The HOA was bleeding, and no one had noticed, until now. The board was formally dissolved under emergency provisions built into the original charter. A temporary administrator was appointed by the County Housing Commission to oversee neighborhood operations until a full re-election could be held. Lee and I offered to help coordinate the transition, but the community had already found its voice. Residents formed committees, one for financial oversight, another for property management, and a third for rewriting the HOA charter from the ground up. They brought in legal observers, transparency advocates, and even a retired judge who lived 3 houses down from the old clubhouse. Elaine's trial was set for the fall. Her legal team tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA refused to pull punches. Too many residents had been exploited. Too many lines crossed. They wanted a public reckoning. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The evidence from the laptop, the forged documents, the surveillance abuse, it all came out. Witness after witness took the stand, neighbors who had been targeted for trivial violations or humiliated in community newsletters. I testified last, not about the fines, not even about the threat letter. I talked about what it cost the neighborhood, the way fear had replaced trust, how people stopped waving at each other, stopped borrowing sugar or helping with gutters, how a community had been turned into a quiet battlefield of cameras and warnings and silent resentment. The jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Elaine was sentenced to 12 years with no chance of parole for at least 6. Her cousin was charged separately and pled guilty to wire fraud. The zoning clerk, disbarred and fined heavily, but what mattered most was what followed. 6 months after the trial, the newly elected HOA board held its first open meeting in the refurbished clubhouse. No executive sessions, no closed doors. Every motion was projected on a screen. Every vote recorded with homeowner input. I didn't run for office. I didn't need to. My job was keeping boats safe and channels clean. But when the new president, a retired school principal named Deshawn, asked if I'd serve as a community consultant for infrastructure planning, I said yes. Not because I wanted power, because I'd seen what happened when the wrong person had it. On a warm Saturday afternoon, I walked the docks with Reese, checking cleats and confirming reservations. A couple of kids waved from a sailboat tied near the pier. Their dad gave me a thumbs up as he fired up the engine. "Feels good out here," Reese said, tightening a rope. "Yeah." "Like things are aligned again." He looked up. "You think it stays that way?" I nodded once. "Only if we keep watch." He smiled and went back to work, and I turned toward the water, watching the tide roll in like a promise. The neighborhood had taken its power back. And this time, it was going to keep it.